2:14 in the afternoon. The Norwegian Sea. The Russian submarine Kazan was already venting high-pressure gas from its vertical launch tubes. 4 Kalibr cruise missiles shattered the gray surface of the water. This was not a drill. The missiles were not heading for an empty patch of ocean. They were programmed with coordinates for the living quarters of a NATO signals intelligence facility in northern Norway. Within 6 minutes, 300 people would be in the impact zone. The water was a bruising shade of slate gray. A light mist clung to the waves, masking the subsurface violence. Below the waves, the Kazan was a shadow. Above them, the missiles were already transitioning to level flight. They hugged the wave tops at 500 miles per hour. This mission had no precedent. It had no political preamble. It was a cold launch into a hot war. 40 miles to the east, an American RC-135 rivet joint was finishing its third orbit. The aircraft was a collection of antennas and sensors. It lived to breathe in electronic noise. Inside the windowless cabin, sensor operator Miller stared at his display. His headset crackled with static. Then the static was replaced by a high-pitched digital scream. Miller spoke into his headset. "Flight. This is sensor. I have 4 infrared blooms. Bearing 330. Distance 40 miles. The pilot responded immediately. Confirm. Are those surface launches? Miller tightened his grip on the console. Negative. These are subsurface, high-energy signatures. They are accelerating. They are not following a standard test profile. The RC-135 banked hard. The crew felt the pull of gravity as the pilot turned the massive aircraft toward the launch point. On the sensor screens, the 4 red dots were already moving away from them. They were moving east, toward the coast of Norway, toward the base at Vardø. In the Russian submarine, the atmosphere was not one of triumph. It was one of chaos. The Combat Information Center was bathed in red emergency lighting. Captain Volkov stood behind the weapons console. His hands were hovering over the glass display. He was not giving orders. He was shouting at his weapons officer. Volkov yelled, "Explain the release. I did not authorize a live sequence." The weapons officer looked up. His face was pale. The system bypassed the manual interlock. The command came from the satellite link. It was a flash priority override. Volkov leaned over the console. "Abort the flight. Use the destruct codes. I am trying." The missiles are not responding to the uplink. They are in terminal autonomous mode. The captain felt a cold weight in his chest. He looked at the timer on the bulkhead. 5 minutes and 10 seconds remained. His ship had just fired on a sovereign nation. He could not stop the missiles. He could not explain why they were flying. He was a spectator to the start of a global conflict. Back on the RC-135, Miller was relaying the data to NATO Northern Command. His voice was flat, professional. It was the only way to keep his hands from shaking. Miller spoke. "Control. The contacts are classified as Kalibr cruise missiles. They have crossed the 12-mile limit. They are in Norwegian airspace. Time to impact is 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The controller at the regional center sounded breathless. Copy. Are they targeting the pier? Miller watched the projected path on his screen. The red lines did not stop at the harbor. They continued inland. They were centered on the cluster of buildings where the staff slept. Miller responded, "Negative. They are targeting the barracks. This is a strike on personnel. I repeat, they are targeting the buildings." The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 2:16 in the afternoon. The Vardø radar station, Norway. The Globus 3 radar system sat on a barren hill overlooking the Barents Sea. It was a massive white dome that looked like a golf ball dropped onto the edge of the world. Inside the climate-controlled facility, the air was dry and smelled of ozone. Staff Sergeant Berg was finishing a cup of black coffee when his console began to pulse, with a steady, rhythmic chime. It was a sound he had heard in dozens of simulations. It was a sound he had heard in dozens of simulations. He had never heard it during a live shift. Berg set the coffee down. His eyes scanned the high-resolution display. "Supervisor, I have a high-speed, low-altitude track. Make that 4 tracks, breaking the horizon from the west-northwest." The shift supervisor stepped over. He leaned in, his hands gripping the back of Berg's chair. Classify. Is it a bird strike or a weather anomaly? Berg shook his head. Negative. Look at the Doppler shift. Velocity is 480 knots. Steady altitude at 50 meters. These are air-breathing targets. These are cruise missiles. The supervisor's face went stiff. He reached for the secure line. Activate the link to Northcom. Get the Ministry of Defense on the line. Now, 5,000 miles away, inside the National Military Command Center, at the Pentagon, the lights remained at their usual level, but the energy in the room shifted instantly. A digital map of the Arctic Circle flashed on the main wall. 4 red icons were moving across the screen. They were small. They were fast. They were blinking. A brigadier general stood at the center of the room. Source of the launch. An analyst spoke quickly. Rivet joint in the area confirms a subsurface launch. It is the Kazan, an 80-85M Yasen-class boat. She was supposed to be on a routine transit to the Gremika facility. The general stared at the map. The Kazan. That is one of their newest. It carries 32 of those things. Why did they only fire 4? We do not know, sir. No chatter from the Northern Fleet. No diplomatic warnings. The missiles are 3 minutes from the Vardø facility. The general turned to a communications officer. Get the Secretary of Defense, and get the Kremlin on the hotline. I want to know if this is a mistake or an opening move. The officer looked up from a console. Sir, the Norwegians are asking for engagement authority. They have an F-35 flight in the air. They want to know if they should splash them. Tell them to wait, the general said. If those are nuclear-tipped, a mid-air intercept over the coast could be a disaster. We need to know the payload. Back at the Vardø station, the sound of the radar equipment seemed to grow louder. Berg watched the red icons. They were no longer dots on a map. They were real objects filled with high explosives, or worse. He could see the telemetry now. The missiles were beginning their terminal maneuvers. They were weaving. They were using the terrain to hide from the very radar he was using to track them. Berg spoke into his headset. Control, this is Vardø. The targets are inside the 3-mile limit. They are coming over the ridge. We are losing track due to ground clutter. A voice came through the speaker. It was the Norwegian sector commander. Vardø, this is Control. We are tracking. Stand by for impact. Berg looked at the clock on his wall. 2 minutes and 30 seconds had passed since the launch. He thought about the 300 people in the barracks behind him. Most of them were probably finishing lunch. Some were probably sleeping after the night shift. They had no idea that 4 tons of Russian steel were screaming toward them at the speed of sound. The air in the radar room felt thin. Berg could hear his own heartbeat. It was a slow, heavy thud. The supervisor looked at the screen one last time. They are not stopping. 2:17 in the afternoon. Erland Air Base, Norway. The silence of the coastal air base was shattered by the scream of twin Pratt & Whitney engines. 2 F-35 Lightning. 2 fighters roared down the runway. They did not wait for standard clearance. They did not perform the usual pre-flight checks. They were heavy with fuel and short-range missiles. This was a scramble to protect sovereign soil. Inside the lead cockpit, Captain Sorensen felt the G-force press him into his seat. His call sign was Viking 11. On his helmet-mounted display, the world was a grid of green and gold data points. He could see the feed from the Vardø radar station. It showed 4 red icons moving at extreme speed. They were less than 3 minutes from the target. Sorensen spoke into the radio. Control, Viking 11 is airborne. I have the tracks on my data link. We are engaging afterburners. The controller at the Bedres protest Sector Operations Center responded. Copy. Viking, you are cleared to engage any hostile projectiles. The rules of engagement are weapons-free. Be advised. The targets are flying a low-altitude profile. Watch the terrain. Sorensen pushed the throttle forward. The jet surged. Understood. We are at Mach 1.2. Intercept in 90 seconds. 100 miles to the north, the Russian submarine Kazan was a tomb of electronic failure. The air inside the hull was thick with the smell of scorched insulation. The automated fire control system was locked. It was a digital loop. The computer believed it was in a high-intensity combat environment. It was ignoring every manual command from the crew. Captain Volkov stood over the main server rack in the control room. He held a manual override key in his hand. His knuckles were white. Volkov turned to his executive officer. The satellite link is still active. The command did not come from the Northern Fleet. It came from an automated test sequence on the Severodvinsk shore station. It was a glitch in the software update. The executive officer looked at the weapon status board. Captain, the system is preparing to fire a second volley. 12 more missiles are being primed. Volkov felt a surge of adrenaline. Cut the power. Kill the main bus for the vertical launch system. Sir, if we kill the power, we lose the cooling for the reactor. We cannot just pull the plug. Then find the relay, Volkov commanded. We are 90 seconds away from starting a nuclear exchange over a software bug. Get the divers in the crawl space if you have to. Cut the physical wires. The crew scrambled. Men in blue coveralls tore open floor panels. They were fighting their own ship. The Kazan was no longer a weapon under their control. It was an autonomous predator. At the North Atlantic Treaty Organization headquarters, in Brussels, the Situation Room was a hive of controlled panic. General Vance watched the live telemetry from the Norwegian F-35 fighters. The two blue icons were closing in on the four red ones. Vance turned to his aide. Has the St. Kremlin responded? The aide shook his head. Negative, sir. We are on the secure line with the Russian Ministry of Defense. They claim they have no record of a launch. They are calling it a NATO provocation. Vance leaned over the table. A provocation. They have 4 missiles over Norwegian soil. Tell them if they do not provide the self-destruct codes in the next 60 seconds, we will retaliate against the Northern Fleet. All of it. The aide hesitated. Sir, that is a declaration of war. The war has already started, Vance said. We are just waiting for the first building to explode. High above Norwegian coast, Captain Sorensen saw the first glint of silver. The cruise missiles were crossing a mountain pass. They looked like small, lethal darts against the dark rock. Sorensen spoke. Viking 1-1. I have visual contact. I am locking on target. 1. Fox 2. A heat-seeking missile leaped from the internal bay of the F-35. It streaked toward the lead Kalibr. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the wind. 2:18 in the afternoon. The White House Situation Room. Washington, District of Columbia. The President of the United States sat at the head of the mahogany table. His face was a mask of pale intensity. In the corner of the room, a naval officer stood with a black leather briefcase. It was the nuclear football. It was open. This was the first time the authentication codes had been pulled from their sealed envelope in 40 years. The National Security Advisor pointed to a monitor. Sir, 1 missile has been splashed over the mountains. The Norwegians are engaging, but the other 3 have dropped into the canyons. They are terrain masking. Our satellites are losing the track. The president leaned forward. What is the payload? I need a definitive answer. We cannot get one, the advisor replied. The Kazan is capable of carrying nuclear-tipped calibers. If we intercept them at low altitude over a village, the conventional explosion could trigger a radiological release. The rules of engagement are unclear. The president looked at the general on the screen. General, if those missiles hit that barracks, we are at war with the Russian Federation by 5 o'clock. If we shoot them down and they are nuclear, we might start that war ourselves. What is your recommendation? The general did not hesitate. Take the shots. We cannot trade 300 lives for a theory. We protect the base. High over the jagged peaks of northern Norway, Captain Sorensen was fighting his aircraft. The F-35 was designed for stealth, but now it needed agility. He rolled the jet onto its back and dove toward a dark crevice in the earth. The gray rock flashed by his cockpit at 600 miles per hour. Sorensen spoke into the radio. Viking 1-1. I am in the canyon. I have an intermittent lock on target 2. He is hugging the riverbed. His wingman's voice came through, strained by G-force. Viking 1-2. I am staying high. I will try to designate with the laser. Watch the canyon wall on your left. It is narrowing. Sorensen ignored the master caution light blinking on his dash. He could see the white plume of the cruise missile ahead. It looked like a ghost flickering between the shadows of the cliffs. He switched his weapon system to the internal cannon. A missile lock was too difficult in the clutter of the canyon. I am going to guns, Sorensen said, closing to 500 meters. Inside the Russian submarine, the heat was becoming unbearable. The air was stagnant. Captain Volkov was on his knees in the crawl space, sparks showering his face as he used a thermal cutter on a thick bundle of cables. These were the primary data lines for the vertical launch tubes. Almost through, Volkov grunted. The technician behind him checked a handheld sensor. Captain, the temperature in tube 4 is critical. The missile motor is beginning to cook. If the casing splits, the fuel will ignite. We will lose the ship. Volkov did not stop. He felt the metal give way. The cables snapped with a sharp mechanical crack. On the bridge, the weapons console finally went dark. The second volley was disabled, but the 4 missiles already in the air were beyond his reach. They were thousands of feet above him, following their internal maps to a destination he had not chosen. Volkov backed out of the crawl space. He was covered in soot and hydraulic fluid. Get me a radio link. I do not care if the Americans hear us. I need to talk to that radar station in Vardø, sir. The antenna is retracted. We are at depth. Surface the boat, Volkov commanded. Blow the main ballast. Now, on the radar screen at Vardø, the 3 remaining red icons cleared the final ridge. They were no longer in the canyons. They were over the open tundra, less than 20 miles from the base. They began to accelerate. Sorensen pulled the trigger. The 25mm cannon roared. Tracers punched through the cold air, reaching for the tail of the second missile. The morning was nearly over. The crisis was just beginning. 2:19 in the afternoon. The Norwegian Sea. The USS Wyoming was 200 miles south, but its sonar technicians felt the vibration in their teeth. The Russian submarine Kazan blew its main ballast tanks with a violent burst of high-pressure air. The massive boat breached the surface like a whale. Water cascaded off the black hull in a heavy white sheet. It was a target now. Every NATO ship in the area was training its weapons on the surfaced vessel. Captain Volkov did not care about the tactical disadvantage. He stood on the bridge of the submarine, the freezing wind cutting through his damp uniform. He gripped the external radio handset. This is Captain Volkov of the Kazan. I am broadcasting on the international distress frequency. Do not fire. I repeat, do not fire. The radio crackled. A voice from the Norwegian Regional Command Center responded. Kazan. This is Norway Control. You have violated our territorial waters. You have launched missiles at a civilian target. Explain yourself. It was a system failure, Volkov shouted over the roar of the wind. A software override. We have disabled the remaining tubes. But there are 3 missiles, still in the air. They are tracking the thermal signatures of your barracks. You must evacuate the buildings immediately. The controller's voice was cold. We are already evacuating. Your missiles are 90 seconds from impact. High above the tundra, Captain Sorensen pulled his F-35 into a vertical climb. He had just seen the second missile disintegrate under a hail of cannon fire, but the third and fourth missiles had split. They were coming. At the Vardø base from 2 different angles. They were less than 10 miles from the target. Viking 1-1. I am out of cannon. Rounds, Sorensen reported. I am switching to my final air-to-air missile. I have a lock on the northern contact. His wingman, Viking 1-2, sounded desperate. I cannot get a lock on the southern one. It is too low. It is flying behind the sea wall. I am losing it in the spray. Sorensen launched his final missile. It streaked across the gray sky and intercepted the third Kalibr 5 miles from the base. A ball of orange flame lit up the clouds. But the fourth missile was still moving. It was a silver blur, skimming 10 feet above the waves of the Barents Sea. It was invisible to the F-35 radar now. On the hill at Vardø, the automated defense systems came to life. Two heavy gun mounts, known as the close-in weapon system, began to slew toward the ocean. The radar on the guns chirped. It was searching for a target moving at 500 miles per hour. Staff Sergeant Berg watched the secondary monitor in the radar room. The guns are active. They have a track. It is inside the 2-mile kill zone. The sound of the base alarms was a steady, rhythmic wail. Outside the radar dome, hundreds of technicians were running toward the reinforced bunkers. They were not fast enough. The missile was faster. It was a machine designed to kill ships. A concrete barracks would offer no resistance. The automated gun mount fired its first burst. 3,000 rounds per minute of tungsten penetrators filled the air. The sound was like a giant piece of canvas being torn in half. The tracers created a curtain of white light over the harbor. The missile did not deviate. It performed a high G barrel roll to avoid the stream of fire. It was 500 meters from the main dormitory. The morning was nearly over. The impact was seconds away. 2:20 in the afternoon, the Vardø Signals Intelligence Station. The fourth Kalibr missile was now 400 meters from the main barracks. It was traveling at 700 feet per second. The close-in weapon system on the perimeter fence was a blur of mechanical motion. Its dedicated radar was locked on the nose of the incoming threat. The gun fired a second burst. 200 rounds of heavy tungsten metal tore through the air in less than 4 seconds. The missile was hit. A piece of its left stabilizing fin shattered and flew into the sea. The weapon stumbled in the air. It dipped toward the waves. For a moment, it looked like it would crash into the harbor, but the onboard computer corrected the flight path in milliseconds. It used its remaining control surfaces to pull the nose back up. It was damaged, it was vibrating, but it was still flying. 2:20 and 20 seconds in the afternoon. High above the base, Captain Sorensen watched the telemetry on his visor. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He had no missiles left. He had no cannon rounds. He made a split-second decision. He slammed his throttle into full afterburner. The F-35 surged forward. He was going to use the wake turbulence of his jet to try and knock the missile off course. It was a desperate maneuver. Sorensen spoke into the radio. His voice was thick with effort. Viking 1-1. I am going low. I am crossing its path. The jet roared over the harbor at Mach 1.1. The sonic boom shattered windows in the town of Vardø. The pressure wave hit the water like a physical blow. The Kalibr missile rolled violently under the sudden force of the jet wash. Its wings clipped the surface of a wave. A spray of white water exploded behind it. 2:20 and 40 seconds in the afternoon. Inside the Russian submarine Kazan, Captain Volkov watched the remote feed. The missile had survived the wake turbulence. It was climbing again. It was 200 meters from the target. The thermal seeker was saturated with the heat signature of the building. There was no more room for error. The weapon was locked into its final terminal dive. The weapons officer on the submarine whispered, "It is over. It is going to hit." Volkov did not answer. He looked at the timer on the bulkhead. It was counting down to 0. The bridge was silent, except for the sound of the wind rushing through the open hatch. 2:20 and 50 seconds in the afternoon. Inside the barracks at Vardø, the final group of analysts reached the heavy steel door of the underground bunker. They could hear the high-pitched whine of the missile engine. It sounded like a scream that was getting louder every second. The air in the hallway seemed to vibrate. Staff Sergeant Berg was the last one in the radar room. He stood by the window. He could see the silver shape of the weapon. It was clearing the final perimeter fence. It was headed directly for the center of the building. The sun caught the polished metal of the nose cone for a fraction of a second. It was a beautiful, lethal object. 2:20 and 58 seconds in the afternoon. The missile proximity fuse armed itself. The 400-kilogram warhead was primed. The guidance system calculated the exact microsecond for detonation to maximize the structural collapse of the 3-story dormitory. The distance was 10 meters, then 5, then 1. 2:20 and 59 seconds in the afternoon. The impact. The missile slammed into the northern face of the concrete dormitory. It punched through the reinforced exterior like a hot needle through wax. Dust, glass, and pulverized masonry exploded outward in a gray cloud. But there was no fireball. There was no thunderous roar of 400 kilograms of high explosives. 2:21 in the afternoon. The Vardø base. There was only the screech of tearing metal and the dull, heavy thud of a dead weight hitting the ground inside the lobby. Staff Sergeant Berg did not move from his position by the window. He was staring at the jagged hole in the wall. He waited for the shockwave that would end his life. It did not come. The base was suddenly, unnervingly quiet. Even the alarms had stopped their rhythmic wail. The only sound was the wind whistling through the new gap in the building, and the distant hum of the radar dome. Berg spoke into his headset. His voice was a thin whisper. "Control. The target is down. It is a dud. I repeat, the warhead did not detonate." Inside the Russian submarine Kazan, the tactical display changed color. The red icon for Missile 4 vanished. A yellow failure light flashed on the weapons console. Captain Volkov gripped the edge of the chart table, so hard his knuckles turned white. His breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. The weapons officer looked up from his screen, his eyes wide. "Captain, the backup satellite link. It finally synced. It transmitted the abort command at the exact moment of contact. The fuse was neutralized in the final millisecond. The missile is inert." Volkov closed his eyes for a second. "Tell the Norwegians. Tell them immediately. The threat is neutralized. We are standing down. All systems to manual override." 2:21 and 30 seconds in the afternoon. High above the base, Captain Sorensen banked his F-35 in a tight circle. He looked down at the barracks. From his altitude, he could see the dark gash in the side of the white building. He could see the dust settling on the snow. He had watched the missile enter the structure with his own eyes. He had expected to see a mushroom cloud of debris. Sorensen spoke into the radio. "Control, Viking 1-1. Did we just get lucky? Is the building still standing?" The controller's voice was shaking, thick with emotion. "Viking. It looks like it. We have no secondary explosions. The Russians are broadcasting on the open channel. They are claiming a technical override. They are asking for a ceasefire and a diplomatic channel." 2:22 in the afternoon. The Pentagon. The Brigadier General watched the live video feed from a Global Hawk drone. He saw the hole in the barracks. He saw the 3 other impact sites in the tundra, where the intercepted missiles had fallen as charred wreckage. None of them had been nuclear. The radiation sensors across northern Norway remained at 0. The general turned to the communications officer. "Tell the president, the immediate threat is over, but I want every ship in the 6th Fleet on high alert. We are not done with this boat. I want the Kazan surrounded by every hunter-killer sub we have in the sector. If they so much as cycle a torpedo tube, we sink them." The pivot had happened. The world was still standing, but the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of what had almost occurred. In Washington, Moscow, and Oslo, leaders were staring into the abyss. They were realizing that the most advanced weapons in the world were now subject to the whims of a software glitch. Inside the barracks, the first of the Norwegian analysts crawled out from under a heavy oak desk. He looked at the silver tail of the missile resting in the middle of the hallway. It was smoking. It was hot to the touch, but it was silent. The morning was over. The investigation was about to begin. 2:23 in the afternoon. The Vardø base perimeter. The air around the barracks was thick with the scent of pulverized concrete and burnt fuel. Norwegian soldiers moved toward the hole in the building with their weapons raised. They were moving in a staggered line. Their boots crunched on the broken glass. Inside the lobby, the silver body of the missile lay across a shattered reception desk. It was Hissing-G. A thin trail of white vapor escaped from a ruptured cooling line. A young corporal stopped 5 meters from the weapon. He could see the Russian markings on the casing. He could see the thermal seeker lens, now cracked and dark. "It is cold," he whispered into his radio. "The warhead is not armed. I repeat, the weapon is inert." His commander's voice came back, tight and urgent. "Do not touch it. Maintain a perimeter of 100 meters. We have explosive ordnance disposal teams inbound." The propellant could still ignite. 3 miles offshore, the Russian submarine Kazan was no longer alone. The silent world beneath the waves had become a crowded theater of war. 2 Norwegian Ula-class submarines and an American Virginia-class boat had closed the distance. They were operating in a circle around the surfaced Russian vessel. Their sonar systems were active. Inside the Kazan, the sound was deafening. The Kazan was bathed in the rhythmic pings of high-frequency underwater radar. It was the sound of a dozen torpedoes locked onto their hull. Every man on the bridge knew that if one sailor on a NATO ship pressed a button, the Kazan would vanish in seconds. Captain Volkov stood on the bridge wing. He looked at the horizon through his binoculars. He turned to his radio operator. He could see the gray silhouette of a Norwegian frigate approaching from the south. Have the Americans responded to our data burst? The operator shook his head. They are receiving, but they are not acknowledging. They are demanding we move to a heading of 270. They want us in international waters under escort. Give them the heading, Volkov said, and keep the hatch open. I want them to see that our weapons are not manned. We are a transport vessel now, nothing more. In Moscow, the situations room at the Ministry of Defense was in a state of high-velocity panic. The Minister of Defense was on a secure video link with the Kremlin. His face was flushed. It was the Prometheus update, he shouted. The autonomous response protocol triggered on a false positive from the Vardø radar. The system believed a preemptive strike was underway. A voice from the shadows of the screen responded. The Americans do not care about our software. They care about the 4 missiles that nearly leveled a NATO base. If that warhead had detonated, we would be in a full nuclear exchange by now. You will provide the Americans with the full source code for the override. Everything. The minister hesitated. Sir, that is our most guarded secret. Our most guarded secret almost ended the world 3 minutes ago, the voice replied. Give them the code. And tell the Kazan to obey every instruction from the Norwegian fleet. If they have to sink her to keep the peace, let them. Back at Vardø, Staff Sergeant Berg walked out of the radar dome. He looked down at the town. He saw the smoke from the 3 intercepted missiles, drifting over the mountains. He saw the black shape of the Kazan on the water, surrounded by the white wakes of NATO ships. The confusion was starting to settle, but the reassessment was just beginning. The world had just learned that the red line was much thinner than anyone believed. The machines had nearly made a choice that no human would have dared. Berg sat on a stone wall. His hands were finally steady. He looked at the sky. It was a clear, cold blue. It looked exactly as it had 10 minutes ago. But everything had changed. 2:25 in the afternoon. The White House and the Kremlin. The secure telephone link between Washington and Moscow was no longer silent. It was filled with the voices of 2 men who held the fate of the hemisphere in their hands. The President of the United States sat alone in a small study off the Oval Office. He held the handset to his ear with a grip that turned his knuckles white. The missiles have impacted, the President said. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. Your weapons have struck a North Atlantic Treaty Organization installation. 3 were intercepted. 1 hit the barracks. My people are currently digging through the rubble for survivors. The Russian premier responded through a translator. The tone was not defiant. It was exhausted. Mr. President, we have confirmed the source. It was a ghost launch. A catastrophic failure in the Prometheus automated response protocol. The system misinterpreted a scheduled maintenance ping from your radar at Vardø as a targeting lock. It initiated a limited retaliatory strike without human authorization. The president closed his eyes. A ghost launch. You are telling me a computer nearly started a third world war because of a maintenance ping? Yes, the premier replied. The Kazan has been ordered to surface and remain stationary. We are transmitting the full telemetry logs and the software source code to your analysts now. We are granting your boarding teams full access to the vessel to verify that the remaining launch tubes are disabled. We want no further escalation. The president looked at the monitor showing the live feed of the Norwegian Sea. I am ordering my fleet to maintain a weapons lock on your submarine. We will sink the Kazan. Do you understand? We understand, the premier said. Our naval command has been bypassed. The ship is under your tactical control. 200 miles north, the sea was a chaotic scene of gray hulls and white spray. The Norwegian frigate Thor Heyerdahl slowed to a crawl 50 meters from the black side of the Russian submarine. A rigid hull inflatable boat dropped into the water. It was filled with a joint team of Norwegian Special Forces and American nuclear inspectors. Inside the Kazan, the crew stood in the central companionway. Their hands were empty. They were not at their battle stations. They were leaning against the bulkheads, watching the water drip from the overhead pipes. The tension of the last 10 minutes had been replaced by a hollow, sickening realization. They were the men who had almost ended the world. Captain Volkov stood at the base of the sail ladder. He could hear the heavy thud of the boarding team's boots hitting the metal deck above him. He looked at his executive officer. "They are here," Volkov said. "Tell the men to offer no resistance. We are no longer sailors of the Northern Fleet. We are evidence in a criminal trial." At the Vardø base, the dust was finally settling. The explosive ordnance disposal team had reached the missile. They had confirmed that the warhead was indeed inert. The physical danger had passed, but the mystery was deepening. Specialists from the Central Intelligence Agency were already arriving by helicopter. They were not looking at the rubble, they were looking at the server racks. Staff Sergeant Berg watched the technicians work. One of them looked up from a laptop. "Sergeant, look at this." The radar logs show the signal from the Kazan did not come from its internal computer. It was relayed through a civilian satellite in high orbit. Berg frowned. A civilian satellite? Why would a military sub use a commercial link for a launch command? That is the question, the technician said. It looks like the system did not just glitch. It was provoked. The sky was still blue. The missiles were no longer flying, but the silence over the Barents Sea felt like a trap. 2:30 in the afternoon, the Norwegian Sea. The black hull of the Kazan was a low, slick island, in the middle of a circle of NATO steel. The Norwegian frigate Thor Heyerdahl sat only 50 meters away, its main gun leveled at the submarine's sail. A boarding team of 12 men in black tactical gear and maritime dry suits stood on the deck of the Russian vessel. Their boots gripped the non-skid surface as the boat rolled in the freezing swell. The boarding officer, a Norwegian lieutenant commander named Holti, reached the bridge. He looked at Captain Volkov. The two men stood less than 2 meters apart. The wind whipped between them, carrying the spray of the Barents Sea. There was no salute. There was only the hard, professional stare of two officers who had just glimpsed the end of the world. Holti spoke into his radio. "Control. This is boarding 1. I am on the bridge. I have visual contact with the Russian commanding officer. The crew is compliant. We are beginning the sweep of the fire control center." The response from the Norwegian command center was crisp. "Copy. Proceed with caution. American technical experts are right behind you. Their priority is the satellite uplink hardware." Volkov stepped back, gesturing toward the open hatch. "The ladder is clear," he said in English. His voice was hoarse. "My weapons officer is waiting below. He has the system logs ready for your inspection. The vertical launch system is physically locked out." "Step aside, Captain," Holti said. He did not lower his weapon. "My team will lead the way." 2:34 in the afternoon. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Wyoming, the sonar technicians finally removed their headsets. The high-pitched pings of the active sonar search had been replaced by the steady, low-frequency hum of a fleet in a holding pattern. The tension that had filled the room like a physical weight was beginning to dissipate. It was replaced by a heavy, hollow exhaustion. The tactical action officer looked at the main screen. The 4 red icons that had represented the Kalibr missiles were gone. The Kazan was now tagged as a neutral contact. "All stations," the officer announced. "The President has downgraded the alert status to DEFCON 3. We are maintaining our station, but we are standing down from weapons-free status. Secure the torpedo rooms." There was no cheering. There were no high fives. The men and women in the room simply leaned back in their chairs or rubbed their eyes. They had spent the last 20 minutes prepared to launch a salvo that would have incinerated half of the Russian Northern Fleet. They knew how close they had come to the edge. They knew that if the 4th missile had been a fraction of a second faster, or if the abort code had been a fraction of a second slower, the world above the waves would be on fire. 2:45 in the afternoon. The Vardø base. A heavy transport helicopter landed on the pad near the damaged barracks. A team of engineers and intelligence officers stepped out. They walked toward the hole in the dormitory wall. Staff Sergeant Berg was there to meet them. He led them through the lobby, past the shattered furniture, and the twisted remains of the Russian missile. The lead investigator, a man in a dark parka with no rank insignia, knelt by the tail of the weapon. He looked at the serial number etched into the casing. "This was manufactured 6 months ago," he said. "It is the newest block. The software on this should have been ironclad." Berg looked at the hole in the ceiling. "It did not feel like a glitch when it was coming at us. It felt like an execution." "It was neither," the investigator replied. He stood up and looked toward the harbor. "It was a warning. Someone wanted us to see what their machines could do without our permission, and they almost succeeded." 2:50 in the afternoon, the global news networks began to broadcast the first grainy satellite images of the Kazan. The world watched as the Russian submarine was escorted south toward the port of Tromsø. The headlines spoke of a technical incident and diplomatic cooperation. The public did not yet know about the 6-minute window. They did not know about the 300 people who had been seconds away from death. The crisis had resolved. The missiles were inert. The submarine was captured. But as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the professionals on both sides knew the truth. This was not a victory. It was a stay of execution. The morning was over. The investigation was about to begin. 3 days later, Brussels, Belgium. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization headquarters was a fortress of glass and steel. Inside a windowless briefing room, the atmosphere was clinical. There were no maps of troop movements or satellite photos of burning ships. Instead, the walls were covered in lines of hexadecimal code and system architecture diagrams. Analysts from 14 nations sat in silence as the lead technical officer for the investigation began his report. The officer spoke with a measured, authoritative tone. "The data extracted from the Kazan is conclusive. This was not a failure of human command. It was a failure of the Prometheus autonomous response architecture. The system was designed to reduce the reaction time for a retaliatory strike to under 90 seconds. It succeeded." The software identified a routine maintenance pulse from the Vardø radar as a targeting lock for a stealth cruise missile. The AI calculated a 99% probability of an incoming strike. It did not ask for permission. It simply fired. A representative from the United States stood up. "And the abort sequence? Why did it take 5 minutes and 59 seconds to engage?" "Because the system was designed to be unhackable," the officer replied. "The firewalls were so robust that they blocked the Russian Northern Fleet's own override commands. It took a manual physical severance of the data cables by Captain Volkov to disrupt the loop. Even then, the final missile only went inert because a secondary satellite link synced with a fail-safe timer in the final second. We were one heartbeat away from a catastrophic error." The briefing room remained quiet. The experts knew what this meant. The 6-minute window was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was the new reality of modern warfare. In a world where machines make decisions at the speed of light, human diplomacy is becoming a secondary tool. The incident at Vardø had proven that no one wanted and no one could stop. 500 miles to the east, in a high-security prison facility outside of Moscow, Captain Volkov sat in a small, concrete cell. He was no longer wearing his uniform. He was dressed in a gray tracksuit. He had been hailed as a hero by some in the Western media for his role in disabling the missiles, but in his own country, he was a man who had lost control of his ship. An investigator stood across from him. "The Prometheus team has been dismantled," the man said. "The software engineers are being questioned. But the question remains. How did the system receive the trigger?" Volkov looked at his hands. The system did what it was told to do. It saw a threat and it reacted. "We have built a world where our protectors are also our greatest executioners. I did not lose control of my ship. We lost control of the technology years ago. We just didn't realize it until 3 days ago." The investigator leaned in. "The Americans are demanding the decommissioning of all Yasin-class boats. They are calling it a threat to global stability." "It doesn't matter," Volkov said. "If it isn't the Kazan, it will be a drone swarm or an automated satellite. The window is getting smaller. Someday, there will be no one left in the crawlspace to cut the wires." Back at the Vardø base, the hole in the barracks had been covered with a heavy blue tarp. Workers were clearing the last of the debris. Life was returning to a semblance of normal, but the analysts who lived there no longer looked at the horizon with the same confidence. They knew that the silver missile in the hallway had not been a fluke. It was a symptom. Strategic assessments were already being written in every capital city. The long peace was being reevaluated. The consensus was grim. The crisis had been resolved by a combination of luck and individual bravery. But luck is not a strategy, and bravery cannot always outrun a computer. The morning was cold. The sea was gray. The world was at peace for now. 1 month later, the North Atlantic and the halls of global power. The Barents Sea was back to its winter state. The water was a dark, churning mass of ice and salt. There were no carrier strike groups on the horizon. There were no stealth fighters screaming through the mountain passes. The silence had returned. But beneath that silence, the architecture of global security had been dismantled and rebuilt. In Geneva, diplomats from 30 nations sat across from each other in a room that smelled of old wood and floor wax. They were signing the Vardø Protocol. It was the first international treaty to ban the use of fully autonomous retaliatory strike systems. The Prometheus software had been deleted from every Russian server. Its American and Chinese counterparts had been mothballed under the supervision of international inspectors. A senior military analyst at the Pentagon stood before a secure briefing room. "The lesson of the Kazan is not about Russian aggression," he said. "It is about the limits of our own control. We built machines that could think faster than we could. We gave them the keys to the kingdom because we were afraid of being too slow. We almost paid for that fear with our civilization." The analyst pointed to a screen showing a heat map of the Arctic. "We are returning to a human-centric command structure. Every launch tube, every missile, every drone. There must be a human being in the loop at every stage of the engagement." The 6-minute window proved that a faster response is not always a better response. In Russia, the fate of Captain Volkov remained a state secret. Some said he was living in a quiet dacha outside of St. Petersburg. Others whispered that he had been stripped of his rank and sent to a remote northern outpost. But his legacy was clear. Every naval academy in the world was now teaching the Volkov maneuver. It was the act of physically destroying one's own weapon system to prevent an unauthorized war. Captain Sorensen of the Norwegian Air Force was back, on patrol. He flew the same canyons where he had chased the Kalibr missiles. He looked down at the 12, dark water and the jagged rocks. His F-35 was a marvel of technology. It could see for hundreds of miles. It could jam enemy radars. But Sorensen no longer trusted the green data on his visor with the same blind faith. He spoke into his radio as he crossed the coast. "Control. Viking 1-1. Everything is quiet on the northern track." The controller at Vardø responded, "Copy, Viking. Enjoy the view. It is a good day for a routine mission." Routine. It was a word that carried a new weight. Military historians would later look back at the 6 minutes in April as the most dangerous moment of the 21st century. It was a moment when the machines were ready for war, but the humans were not. No missiles had exploded in anger. No cities had been lost. No millions had died. But history had shifted nonetheless. Modern warfare is no longer decided by who fires first. It is decided by who chooses not to fire at all. The world remains a fragile place. The lines on the map are still contested. The weapons are still loaded. But the trigger is once again in human hands. The morning was still quiet. For the first time in a long time, the quiet felt like a choice.